So I'm shooting this video down in Texas at a retreat center called Laity Lodge. I've been here meeting with some Christian university faculty, and we've been talking about how faith relates to teaching and learning. And one of the topics that's come up in conversation is intercultural learning. So how we learn about cultural differences and how we learn to understand and communicate with people who've had a different cultural formation from the one we received. Now, that was the topic of a book I wrote some years ago called Learning from the Stranger. It was kind of a follow-up to an earlier book called The Gift of the Stranger, which focused specifically on language learning the languages of other people in relation to Christian faith. Learning from the Stranger is a little broader. It thinks about cultural difference. Cultural difference doesn't just mean different foods, different clothes, different movies. Cultural difference has to do with the way we've been shaped, the way we've learned to approach the world, the kinds of assumptions and patterns of behavior that we've acquired just by growing up in a particular time and place. So to take a real life example, imagine two people having an email conversation. One of them's from Germany and one of them's from the Midwest of the United States. Chances are the person in Germany grew up learning a communication style where the way you show that you're engaged with the other person, the way you show you care about the conversation, is to be very direct and upfront. If you have criticisms, you make them right away, you say what you think. Whereas the person in the Midwest has probably learned a communication style where the way that you show that you're engaged with the other person, that you care about them, is you try to keep things very positive. If you have a criticism to make, you say 5 positive things first and slip the criticism in indirectly a little later on. Now a conversation starts up, you start exchanging emails, and before long there's some kind of misunderstanding, and they both start trying to repair the misunderstanding. As the American tries harder, they try to become more positive. They try to be less direct. They try to make less forthright statements. Whereas when the German tries to engage harder, they tend to become more direct. They tend to become more forthright. And before long, the German's convinced that the American's not really interested in talking to them because they never actually make a direct assertion. And the American's pretty convinced that the German is rude and aggressive and doesn't like them. And they stop talking to each other. That example's drawn from a real-life study in intercultural communication. Now, the problem here might not be that the people on either end have ill will towards each other or that they're not trying to be good people. The problem is that they've learned different cultural patterns that don't fit together with each other. And unless they've got some skill at recognizing these and understanding how to adjust, it's going to be hard for them to communicate well. Now, Learning from the Stranger was written because of awareness of a specific gap. There were a bunch of Christian books around about cultural difference and how to deal with it that described differences between cultures, and some of them were very good. But there was a tendency for them to draw a lot of their examples from the mission field, from mission trips overseas, and there was also a bit of a tendency for them to have pictures on the covers of people from the rainforest with face paint and bows and arrows. There was this sense that cultural difference was something that lived a long way away. It was something you might encounter if you traveled to the other side of the world, and it was something that was mostly of interest to people who were going to do mission trips or missionary work. But these days, that's not a true picture of cultural difference. These days, you only have to go down to your local coffee shop to run into someone whose cultural formation was not quite the same as yours. It doesn't matter what area you work in. You can work in business, you can work in sales, you can work in education. You're going to run into people who've had a different cultural formation, whose communication patterns are not the same as yours. And you're going to have to deal with it to be successful in those environments and to deal well with those people. So what Learning from the Stranger argues is that learning about other cultures is not some kind of special skill or special intelligence gathering for people who are going to go on missions to other countries. It's actually a basic life skill, and it's also a Christian life skill because Scripture calls us to love our neighbor as ourselves. In fact, in Leviticus 19, it says, love your neighbor as yourself, and then just a few verses later it says, love the foreigner as yourself, love the alien as yourself, love the person who's not like you, who's not from your community. Well, if you actually want to love another person, treat them as made in the image of God, and do that well, you need some way of interacting with their communication style successfully. You need to understand where they're coming from. You need to not misinterpret their behaviors as hostility, not to get their signals wrong. And so if we want to actually successfully love our neighbors, given that most of the people in the world are not like us culturally, wherever we start from, whoever we are, then we need to learn some cross-cultural skills. So the book sets out some theological framework for thinking about cultural difference. Where does that fit into Christian theology? Where does learning about other cultures fit into Christian growth, Christian formation? How can we actually become more Christian by learning about cultures that are different from our own? And what are the skills that we need to actually engage with cultural difference? How does cultural difference work? What kinds of dispositions, abilities, sensitivities do we need to develop if we're going to operate well in a world where there's a great deal of cultural difference and it's all around me in my immediate environment? So that's what the book's about. That's why it's called Learning from the Stranger, because the focus wasn't on traveling overseas necessarily, but just on learning to love well, learning to interpret well, learning to communicate well in a world of cultural differences.